All right, welcome back from break. Let's get started. We are very glad to have David Elliot with us for our next presentation entitled Mirabile dictu, the emotion of wonder and awe, or admiratio, and its moral role in Thomas Aquinas. David Elliot is a professor at the Catholic University of America. He specializes in fundamental Catholic moral theology, virtue ethics, and the moral theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. His PhD is from Notre Dame, and he has been teaching at Catholic University of America since 2017. Let's welcome David.
Thank you so much, Cameron, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me and to the other presenters. Really enjoyed the papers so far. This is the unenviable after lunch slot where everybody is struggling to keep up our attention. But actually, this is a good topic for kind of rousing you up, I hope. So this topic is to do with St. Thomas Aquinas, who's writing in the 13th century, so the High Middle Ages. And it's quite interesting because Thomas famously showed considerable interest in the passions or emotions and their role in the moral life. So it's been claimed that his so-called treatise on the passions and the Summa Theologiae is unprecedentedly elaborate. It's even been argued that it probably constituted the longest sustained discussion of the emotions ever written at that point. Whether that's true or not, it certainly stands out as a high watermark in the medieval West. Thomas himself makes sophisticated arguments about what the passions are, the extent to which they're responsive to reasons, and how they're integrated into and become a positive asset in the happy and virtuous life. In this paper, I want to examine his account of the complex and morally important passion he calls admiratio and is usually translated wonder or awe. I'll discuss both what he thinks the emotion is, how it relates to its objects, and the important role he assigns it in the moral life as a whole. Admiratio is usually translated wonder, awe, admiration, or amazement. But how well do those track the Latin? So a source like Webster's defines wonder as the rapt attention or astonishment at something awesomely mysterious or new to one's experience, and awe as an emotion combining dread, veneration, and wonder. These aren't terribly far from admiratio in Thomas's sense, which he defines curiously as a species of fear resulting from apprehension of a thing that exceeds our capacities, and or from contemplation of a lofty truth. Aquinas himself was fascinated by this passion, both for reasons of what we might just think of as overall classification or taxonomy of the emotions, but also for a key role in moral formation, part of which is philosophical, part theological. In my talk, I'll first examine what he thinks admiratio is and then address its practical moral role. So I'll have the first section where I just set forth admiratio as a passion in its own right. The second will take up his way of classifying it as a very qualified form of the emotion fear. Third, its overall role with respect to the virtues that regulate the passions. And then fourth, a certain practical role which he foresees for this emotion in relation to morality, as well as to learning, culture, and the arts. So to begin, I'll clarify Thomas's own terms, and particularly the word admiratio, which is the one he consistently uses for this emotion. His sources for it range from classical authors to the Vulgate Bible, from the Church Fathers to Latin translations of Aristotle, which he was very avid in accumulating in their various iterations. The base Latin word mirum is famously ancient and means wonderful, marvelous, astonishing, extraordinary, amazing. Mirum est, for example, is a standard way to say it's amazing. In the imperial period, mirum was often replaced by mirabilis, from which we get the phrase mirabile dictu, wondrous to tell or amazing to say. These senses are shared between classical and medieval scholastic Latin. Thus, Virgil in the Aeneid says it was Mirabile dictu, when Aeneas suddenly appeared out of a mist caused by his mother Venus. In a very different vein, a medieval monk from Byland Abbey in Yorkshire began a ghost story in Latin with the words Mirabile dictu quod scribo. Mirum relates to miraculum, which refers to wonders as a kind of object, ranging from prodigies and portents to colossal monuments like the 7 wonders of the world, in Latin called the Miracula Septem. And as might be expected in Christianity, miraculum had the forthright sense of miracle. From mirum, Thomas gets the verb miror, to wonder or marvel at, to be astonished or amazed at a thing. His own preferred verb for it, though, was admiror, where the prefix ad, to or toward, captures not just the feeling of awe or wonder in the subject, but also has a certain stress on the object at which we're amazed, due to its extraordinary greatness, sublimity, or perfection. Hence, admiror often carries the sense of gazing passionately at something. And likewise, the associated noun admiratio, which he consistently uses, has its object mirabilia, that is, objects which exceed our power and understanding, at least in part, due to their greatness. And this is all the more the case if they're rare, new, surprising, or unfamiliar. These points should make clear that admiratio, Thomas's key word for wonder and awe, differs importantly from the associated English word admiration. But in terms of formal conceptual definition, he makes perhaps the unexpected claim that admiratio is a species of fear or timor. That view is far from obvious, and others have argued that wonder or awe should be thought of as a form not of fear, but of something like exhilaration or joy. For example, in a classic pre-Burkean essay, Joseph Addison said, quote, "Our imagination loves to be filled with an object or to grasp at anything that is too big for its capacity, such as a vast, uncultivated desert, huge heaps of mountains, high rocks and precipices, or a wide expanse of waters. We are flung into a pleasing astonishment at such unbounded views and feel a delightful stillness and amazement in the soul," unquote. A pleasing astonishment of something that makes us feel pleasantly amazed and slightly small is familiar, not just in nature, but of course in the arts, where we might think of something like our reaction to Homer's Odyssey, to the Apollo Belvedere, the Sistine Chapel, or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So why not say that admiratio is a form of joy or gaudium in some sense, rather than timor or fear? Or are there perhaps multiple forms of it? Thomas's own answer to this is nuanced, but I want to begin by looking at why, time and again, he classifies admiratio as a complex species of fear, from his commentaries on Aristotle to his works of theology. So the idea here is that fear, like all passions, is a motion of the sensitive appetite. For Thomas, appetites arise from natural forms as a kind of needy inclination to pursue goods which are proper to those natural forms, and to avoid evils unsuitable to them. Our sense appetite is passive in the sense that it's moved by cognition, and as such, it can be passive to objects which have the power to move or incline us when they're apprehended in conjunction with what he calls the estimative or cogitative power, which regards those objects as either good or harmful. The passions are distinguished not just by good and evil simply for Thomas, but by whether the good that attracts or the evil that repels us involves some difficulty in either getting it if it's good or avoiding it if it's bad. Passions of attraction and aversion simply he calls concupiscible, and those that involve difficulty are called irascible. He states, quote, "Therefore, whatever passions regard good or evil absolutely, simpliciter, belong to the concupiscible power, for example, joy, sorrow, love, hatred, and such like, whereas those passions which regard good or bad as arduous, through being difficult to avoid or obtain, belong to the irascible faculty. Such are daring, fear, hope, and the like, unquote. The concupiscible passions have to do with attraction to what we want and plain aversion from what we don't want. The irascible passions indicate that we've hit some obstacle in our preferred path of getting or avoiding, resulting in a struggle. In a compressed summary, Thomas writes, quote, "In movements of the appetitive faculty, good has, as it were, a force of attraction, while evil has a force of repulsion. In the first place, then, good causes in the appetitive power a certain inclination, aptitude, or connaturalness in respect of good. This belongs to the passion of love, amor, the corresponding contrary of which is hatred, odium, in respect of bad. But if the good be not yet possessed, it causes in the sensitive appetite a movement towards the attainment of the good beloved, and this belongs to the passion of desire or concupiscence. The contrary of this, in respect of evil, is the passion of aversion or dislike. Thirdly, when the good is obtained, it causes the appetite to rest, as it were, in the good obtained, and this belongs to the passion of delight or joy, delectatio vel gaudium. The contrary of which, in respect of evil or bad, is sorrow or sadness, dolor vel tristitia. So these are the passions of what he calls the concupiscible appetite. He then adds those of the irascible passions, saying, in respect of a difficult good not yet obtained, we have hope or despair. In respect of a bad difficult to avoid, but not yet present, we have fear and daring. But evil already present gives rise to the passion of anger. Okay, so that's his sort of brief, condensed summary of the different formalities of the passions. The irascible appetite is where fear specifically is located in the region of obstacles and struggles. Specifically, he says, we fear something if we view it obviously as bad, not good, future, not present, and difficult rather than easy to avoid. If it were good, we would instead hope for it. If such an evil were present, we would feel anger, he says, not fear. And if it were easy to avoid, we wouldn't fear it at all. We would just regard it as a trivial thing to overcome. So the formalities that cause fear are that it's perceived as bad, it looms in the future, and evading it can be very difficult. Fear for Thomas is therefore a passion or motion which flees or shrinks from a future threat or evil that is difficult to escape. On the part of the subject, fear is caused by love, in that we fear losing what we love. Crucially, fear is also, he says, caused by our lack of power or incapacity, ex aliquo defectu virtutis, since it's that lack of power which makes us unable to easily repel an imminent threat or harm. But there must be some hope of escape, or else we wouldn't feel fear, we would simply feel despair. Like other passions, fear, Thomas says, involves physical transmutation. In particular, fear causes bodily contraction so that our heat and vital spirits are withdrawn inwardly, making us frigid and prone to lose our speech. And it causes trembling, pallor, and, he says, chattering of the teeth. The opposite of fear is daring, which isn't a passion of shrinking from a future threat or evil, but boldness in confronting it. I'll turn now to where exactly admiratio fits into fear. Thomas construes fear as a complex passion, which can take several different forms. He follows a Greek father, John Damascene, in saying that there are 6 distinct species or kinds of fear. It's just really interesting. He doesn't think of fear as a sort of simple property, but it's complex. These 6 species are laziness, embarrassment or erubescentia, shame, verecundia, wonder, admiratio, stupor, and anxiety, agonia. He clarifies that, quote, since fear is a passion coming from something harmful, apprehended as exceeding our capacity, the types of fear will be differentiated according to the difference in such harmful things. Now, what's harmful can be referred to the one affected in different respects. With regard to knowledge, he says, it refers to some object of knowledge that's apprehended as altogether exceeding cognition. Now, its exceeding cognition, he says, may be due to its greatness. And then the passion is awe, or admiratio, which is fear from the imagination of something great. Okay, unquote. So the passion of awe or admiratio, he says, is fear which regards knowledge, specifically some object of knowledge apprehended as exceeding cognition or comprehension. Hence the sense of amazement, and the reason why it exceeds cognition is due to its greatness relative to us, rather than something like its unintelligibility in itself. But it's still unclear what the bad object is, which would even make this a passion of fear. Why not instead say this is a passion of hope, for example, a hope to better understand what presently eludes or mystifies us? Thomas himself sums up this basic problem of taxonomy by saying, fear is only of what is bad, but wonder, admiratio, regards great and unaccustomed things, whether they are good or bad. Thus, he notes, drawing on Aristotle, philosophers have been led by wonder to seek the truth, and that wonder is the beginning of all wisdom, being, as it were, the road to the search of truth. This sounds highly positive, not evil at all. Since wonder can regard good and not just harmful things, it might seem, he concludes, that admiratio isn't a species of fear after all. Now, in one sense, Thomas concedes this point. Non quaelibet admiratio et stupor sunt species timoris. Not just any wonder is a species of fear, but that wonder which is caused by a great bad or evil, magno malo. An example of that kind of fear might be when Pliny the Younger said to Tacitus, "The mind shudders to remember the volcanic destruction of Roman Pompeii." But then we seem to also have forms of admiratio that are not fear, that could map instead onto the wonder of the philosopher or the scientist, for example. Thus, Thomas describes the admiratio of someone who sees an eclipse without knowing its cause and is led to fascination and inquiry. This doesn't sound like fear at all, but something more like lively curiosity or fascination. So is admiratio for Thomas essentially a species of fear or not? There are actually a few different interpretive options here. One is simply to say that admiratio is an analogous term, like healthy, predicated both of a patient and of medicine, with distinct but nevertheless related meanings. On that view, admiratio could mean wonder in the sense of curiosity, fascination, desire to know in one context, and then something more like the feeling of awe in another. Thomas does leave that interpretation open, but he seems to prefer holding on to the different senses of admiratio in close conjunction with fear. So in the exact the paragraph where he seems to concede a kind of wonder that isn't fear, he immediately pulls the discussion back to fear, adding, quote, "Or we may say that, just as laziness shrinks from the toil of external work, so admiratio shrinks from the difficulty of considering a great and unaccustomed thing," unquote. And his Latin for "or we may say" is vel potest dici, and vel, unlike out, doesn't usually denote an exclusive or, take one or the other only, but an inclusive or in which both options may be equally feasible or even compatible. Likewise, citing Aristotle's Metaphysics, he notes that wonder or admiratio attracts interest and inquiry, whereas fear leads to flight and aversion. Still, instead of conceding that wonder isn't a species of fear, he says, those who fear wonder do fear in that they shrink or shy away from forming an immediate judgment about what amazes them, precisely because it eludes their full comprehension. It's almost like somebody standing at the bottom of a mountain looking up. Just it's too big for their gaze to take in, and so they stand there with a sense of amazement. As he says elsewhere, admiratio is a kind of fear resulting from the apprehension of a thing that surpasses our faculties. And this arresting of our attention is even greater if it results from the contemplation of a lofty truth, something like the nature of black holes instead of just a crossword puzzle. So if someone contemplates an eclipse and feels a certain kind of fear, the fear of admiratio or awe, the bad he fears isn't the eclipse, rather the fear regards his sense of inadequacy in trying to understand the eclipse. So you have two things going on, a keen intellectual interest and desire on the one hand, and a kind of shrinking feeling that flows from awareness of one's limitation in grasping it, at least at first. And this feeling is compounded, enhanced, if the object is novel, worthy, and striking to us. So this account would qualify admiratio as fear, construed as a kind of appreciative awe, combined with a shrinking sense of inadequacy, as with the philosopher, theologian, or scientist who feels overwhelmed in the face of some great mystery. But by this point, it should be clear that admiratio isn't fear in the quotidian sense of being alarmed, panicked, or frightened by something dangerous or threatening. Rather, it's a complex response to something that attracts and overawes us. We can rightly translate timor as fear, but Thomas's concept of timor is probably more extensive than what we usually mean by fear in English. Okay, I turn now to the moral stakes and role which Thomas assigns to this passion. His account presupposes that, like emotions in general, the occurrence of wonder isn't always rightly ordered or self-validating. For our experience of admiratio to be reasonable and ordinate, he holds that it should be regulated by virtue. Thomas follows Aristotle here in saying that we govern the body with despotic or absolute rule, but that reason can only govern the sensitive appetite, and thus our passions, with a more limited monarchical rule. Thus I can just will to lift my arm, but I cannot just decide to feel joyful or command my sorrow to go away. In his view, the passions are not fully ordered or participatory in reasons, but they are responsive to reasons. They participate in a limited way, and therefore they can be, as it were, persuaded, even if they can't be commanded. For example, someone feels anger because a hammer hits their thumb and causes pain. Then they tell themselves that it wasn't the hammer's fault, and they either feel ridiculous or at least the anger begins to subside. Or someone might see a mouse and perhaps scream, but then reflecting that it's not dangerous, they would calm down. So there's a sense that the reasoning and deliberating about the emotion itself has an effect on its quality or intensity. To consistently order the passions to the extent we're able, which he views as limited regardless, but to order them to the due measure, habituates us into the virtues of temperance and fortitude. For Thomas, the virtues modify the person as a substance by actualizing or perfecting the powers in which particular virtues are subject. So fortitude rightly orders the irascible appetite and passions, temperance, the concupiscible appetite and passions, justice, the rational appetite or the will, and so forth. This can be done more or less thoroughly, and in that sense, Thomas speaks of the virtues as being more or less, as being more thoroughly rooted in the powers so that they participate in those forms better or not so well. In common with his contemporaries, Thomas also distinguished between acquired or natural cardinal virtues obtained in a long process of habituation, and also infused or supernatural cardinal and theological virtues initially bestowed by God's grace, but then which our agency cooperates with. So you've got a kind of abundant moral ecosystem of habits, virtues, and so forth. But within that whole suite of habits and virtues, temperance and fortitude rightly order our sensitive appetites. And since admiratio is a species, he says, of fear, and fear belongs to the irascible appetite, it follows that admiratio is regulated by fortitude, the virtue which well orders the irascible appetite. This means that if I have fortitude, I'll characteristically feel the right kind and degree of awe and amazement towards objects I encounter. So the rash science student might feel no awe in studying quantum physics or black holes, assuming they're easy to figure out with a little help from AI or something like that. Or at the opposite extreme, a student like that might feel completely overawed, baffled, confounded, and simply give up inquiry. Thomas calls that reaction stupor. By contrast, the student or learner who is admirans, who wonders in a proportionate way, feels the appropriate degree of awe and will alter his course of studies accordingly, such as dedicating more time, effort, and concentration to it. So it ends up being a kind of stimulus in that way. The virtue of temperance concerns the concupiscible appetite, and so that doesn't directly regulate fear or admiratio. But nevertheless, there's an important supplementary role here. Thomas holds that the desire for knowledge, like the desire for food and drink, is regulated by temperance. To be precise, the desire for knowledge is rectified by the part of temperance he calls studiositas, and its opposite is curiositas, where we get studiousness and curiosity. Monastic terms going back to the early fathers, used a lot in St. Augustine. Thus, he says it would be a form of curiositas to seek knowledge of vain, salacious, lurid, or harmful things. Some of those might genuinely cause awe or admiratio, whether in the form of morbid fascination or interest in superstitious practices. But this would be non-virtuous admiratio, something to be countered by studiositas, the part of temperance which regulates our desire for knowledge. So while wonder or admiratio in general is viewed by him as a positive moral resource, it isn't self-validating, and like the passions in general, is to be regulated by the virtues. All right, I want to turn now to the moral role which Thomas assigns to admiratio in education, learning, and other aspects of the moral life as he sees it. Drawing on Aristotle, he says that, quote, wonder is the beginning of wisdom, being, as it were, the road to the search of truth as stated in the beginning of the metaphysics, unquote. Wonder is obviously the opposite of boredom, cynicism, indifference, apathy, and so forth. Aristotle notes the obvious fact that wonder implies the desire to learn, so that what causes wonder is to be desired. For Thomas, admiratio is to education and learning a prod or stimulus that initiates study that might otherwise never happen or only be done in response to external threats or to some sort of reward outside of interest in the subject, like grades or getting a career. In addition, Thomas gives elaborate arguments to the effect that wonder aids memorization, and it increases our attention and apprehension of something, so that admiratio doesn't just initiate and sustain a process of learning or study, it actually helps us better to learn, all things being equal, making it a key ingredient in education and mastery of all branches of learning. But how exactly does wonder or admiratio do this? I noted earlier that though fear regards something bad or defective, that admiratio, in Thomas's account, can be stimulated by good things, such as metaphysics or the natural sciences, and by the greatest goods and intellectual mysteries there are, all the way up to the divine nature. Precisely because they pose a much greater intellectual challenge, one's inadequacy in considering them may be greater, so that, in a sense, the greater and more complex the thing one is captivated by, the greater one's awe will tend to be. But as Thomas also adds, love is the cause of fear. So I'll feel greater fear in the sense of admiratio, the more I love and wish to understand some truth which at the moment seems to overwhelm me. This love is a key ingredient in our relationship to the object marveled at, making clear that admiratio isn't what we would call horror. As Thomas notes, wonder is actually a cause of pleasure, insofar, he says, as it includes a hope of getting the knowledge which one desires to have. So the object we fear in the sense of admiratio may very well be good. Our regard for it, caused by love, an effect of it be pleasure. Even though the passion of awe itself is still classified as fear, due to the fact that its precise felt quality or tang depends on what he calls our lack of power or incapacity to fully grasp it. When we add that admiratio is heightened by what is novel, striking, and unaccustomed to us, what you get is a complex cluster of affective responses that helps someone sustain attention, inquire with greater focus, and remember better what it is they're studying or contemplating. And this makes wonder or admiratio a kind of precious pedagogical resource. The problem is that wonder isn't simply there for the taking whenever we wish. Admiratio's causality is more elusive than many emotions. The process of causing sadness, joy, or anger is typically more straightforward and even more predictable than the process of causing wonder, awe, or admiration. There's no pill for curing absence of wonder or awe that a pharmaceutical could put on the market. One can't just choose to feel wonder and awe or easily cause others to feel it. But if we're guided artfully to see a subject as awe-inspiring, Thomas assumes we're more likely to be captivated and take an interest. He has well-developed ideas about how this might be gone about, which touch upon admiratio's important place within culture and the arts generally. To this end, he cites with approval a passage of Aristotle's Rhetoric. Quote, "Since learning and wonder, admiratio in his Latin translation, are pleasant, all things connected with them must also be pleasant. For example, a work of imitation, such as painting, sculpture, poetry, and all that is well imitated. The same may be said of dramatic turns of fortune and narrow escapes from danger. For all these things excite admiratio," unquote. Following Plato, Aristotle discusses the moral value of mimesis in music, painting, sculpture, and other media, and says that apart from being pleasant, such imitation inspires enthusiasm, and that when people hear imitations, their feelings tend to move in sympathy with what is represented. Hence the whole anxiety about what kind of music the youth were listening to. Generally, these representations involve, Aristotle says, states of character, at least if they're elaborate enough. And these states of character engage our sympathy and invite our approval, making it important to move with or sympathize with the right things in mimesis. Now, initially, this may not seem always to be the case. It's far from obvious, for example, that being captivated by beautiful or moving imagery always motivates some corresponding action. Lovers of Hamlet, for example, show no observable tendency to feign insanity or develop an avenging streak. Appreciation of the play is perfectly compatible with doing nothing about the experience. Yet Survey Pincairns has rightly stressed that aesthetic judgments are far more closely related to moral values than often thought. Many of our deepest priorities are fueled by evaluative judgments in which moral and aesthetic aspects are entangled, hence the well-known concern of parents over the kind of stories and forms of entertainment their young children consume. Here, of course, we counter a divide between authors such as Plato, Aristotle, Thomas, Dante, many others, who wish our interaction with literature and the arts to help shape our affective and other responses so that we conform to paradigms of an objective or virtuous morality and to approved moral exemplars. This contrasts with authors such as Bernard Williams, Jeffrey Stout, Martha Nussbaum, and to a degree Julia Annis, who think the virtuous person is less reliant on uniform responses and fixed norms, due, for example, to the moral improvisation which prudence or individuality allows, and who therefore think we should focus less on self-consciously forming people through mimesis, culture, and the arts towards morally prefabricated ends, and focus more on using it to help them become good moral perceivers who can make up their own minds about the kind of life they see as good or happy. For his part, St. Thomas fully approves Aristotle's account as he understands it and borrows from it the point that it is natural for someone to be pleased with representations. Representatio is his term from mimesis. And that the less advanced someone is in learning, the more they need to, quote, attain intellectual truths through sensible objects, such as stories, examples, and so forth. This is part of why he says Scripture should have metaphors. The existence of the poet, in fact, is morally important for Aquinas. He writes, et ad hoc ordinator poetica, nam poete est ducere ad aliquad virtuosum, per aliquam decensum representationem. It is the task, or it is of the poet, to lead us to something virtuous by means of some excellent representatio. This might seem like a pure instrumentalization of the arts to morality's ends, but as we'll see, Thomas views the moral good, the bonum honestum, and beauty, or pulchritudo, as intimately related so that they're not in a kind of competitive zero-sum game. One way he thinks this kind of motivation happens is when a representatio, again, that's his word from mimesis, has the power to change our minds by getting past what he thinks of as our wanted dispositions. We may, he says, incline to one side of a moral perspective because of some imaginative representation. Echoing Aristotle's point about moving in sympathy, Thomas says that imagination may move the passions and ultimately lead the will to be moved itself. Dante is so taken with this point that the patients of his purgatory are in part morally rehabilitated by, for thousands of years, rehearsing various stories and exempla of the virtues from classical and biblical literature in tones of praise and aspiration. Now, Thomas's point isn't just the fairly obvious one that imaginative and aesthetic consumption affects attitudes and habituation, so that media, culture, and the arts have tremendous ethical force, even if indirectly, rather than didactically. His point is rather that imagination through the passions may get around the existing bias of habits or accustomed dispositions so that we temporarily feel or perceive differently regarding a subject from how we're accustomed. This is because we experience feelings of joy, sadness, anger, hope, or love, creating what he calls a temporary dispositio, which may differ in quality from the agent's existing habits, making someone, this is sort of the punchline for him, making something seem good to him, which does not seem good to him ordinarily. This dispositio affects our perspective in a way that may incline the will itself in a new direction or simply be bottled up and disregarded. Now, it's important to stress that this isn't just seen by him as an emotional contagion or a kind of psychological gimmick or bypass. Thomas doesn't think the agent's practical reasoning is put to sleep, and he affirms that the will can simply resist these motions. He has a complex account of how theoretical and practical reason engage imagination and affect. For my purposes, what matters is his view that the moral good, the bonum honestum, when it is well portrayed through representations, may be perceived, he says, not just as beautiful, but as morally attractive, as spiritually beautiful, he calls it. Precisely what the good poet or artist, he says, should help us to do. If perceived in this way, the good will appear to us, he says, as an object of desire, and this may arouse a wondrous love for goods towards which we may previously have been unresponsive, as well as the moral ideals they represent. So to take the kind of biblical example he might have had in mind, we need only consider, for example, the vast difference in power and motivation between someone being told that God is merciful in the abstract and then being shown the idea with supreme artistry and moral imagination in Christ's parable of the prodigal son. Or the difference between being simply commanded to love your neighbor and being shown the same point dramatically articulated in the parable of the Good Samaritan. A successful story or representation of this broad kind, his idea is, explores a moral value or commitment in such a way as to more fully capture its appeal, throwing the admirable qualities of a good into bold relief in dramatically compelling ways, aiding self-knowledge by considering familiar obstacles and rationalizations, encouraging us that what looked implausible at first can in fact be done, and extending moral knowledge by probing aspects of the moral good we may not have considered and yet may now find inspiring. Hence, a task of the arts, Aquinas says, is to lead us to something virtuous by some excellent representation. And he holds that excellent representations are precisely the kind which are likely to stimulate wonder or produce awe. So according to Thomas, admiratio may regard good objects and yet still be a form of fear. That isn't because the thing we're in awe of is bad. What's bad in the sense of a lack is the defect in our ability to grasp it. Thomas explains the rationale while discussing the awe or fear that even the saints feel for God in heaven, he says. The reason for this admiratio is, quote, every creature is infinitely distant from God, and this deficiency will never be removed. Reverential fear regards this deficiency which will remain in heaven, a fear that will show reverence to our Creator as we leap down from the consideration of his majesty to our own insignificance, unquote. This scenario is, so to speak, awe or admiratio in a kind of chemically pure or elevated state. As he elsewhere puts it, in heaven, quote, fear is taken away as regards the act that is the fearing of separation or harm. But fear will remain as regards the act that is to be in awe and revere God as arduous. And this latter occurs when a man shrinks into his own smallness from consideration of so great a height, unquote. This is obviously a very different kind of fear from anxious aversion to a threat. His point in that passage is obviously theological, but it also helps to illustrate why it is that the loftiest goods tend to arouse awe, and by extension, why it is that works of cultural and artistic genius, such as King Lear, Michelangelo's Last Judgment, or Mozart's Requiem, don't just convey a sense of beauty, but tend to arouse wonder. As Thomas puts it, such works succeed in making, quote, the majesty and dignity of the very things they depict apparent or manifestum. And that becoming apparent happens only through successful and adroit mimesis or representatio, whereas applauding or wooden allegory might just leave us cold and aloof. Without that making apparent, Thomas says, the qualities contemplated, quote, would not seem worthy of contemplation, and the wonder, admiratio, that attracts the contemplation, unquote. So a key point of his account at this juncture is this: the way such works depict states of moral character fosters awe, not just for the works of art, but for the moral qualities themselves that the works of art portray. The awe or wonder aroused by various cultural, scripture, and artistical representations, if they do represent moral character well, in such a way that we sympathize or incline towards it, doesn't on his account just have aesthetic value, it has moral value that is of enormous benefit. So Thomas Aquinas was himself deeply interested in this passion, partly for reasons of taxonomy, but also for its ethical contribution. The moral role he assigns to admiratio, without being dominant, is genuinely vast. It motivates learning, it facilitates memory, keeps boredom and cynicism at bay, increases our loves by enhancing appreciation, and in general, it helps to keep us interested in life. Teachers routinely lament students' lack of wonder or interest and reproach themselves for failing to arouse it. So the value of this passion is clear. Thomas views it as the beginning of wisdom as well, in that it fuels all intellectual inquiry, and he sees it as a key ingredient within philosophy, science, religion, great literature, culture, and the arts, one which has a distinct moral value. Thank you.